Chapter 3. A Baffling Note. Mr. Moore's accusation left Nancy speechless for a few seconds. Finally, she asked him how she had broken the law. The young man looked at her superciliously. She judged that he was not very many years older than she, and his attitude annoyed her. But out of respect for his position, she said nothing. "Miss Drew," he began, "you may not be aware of this, but it is against the law to invite mail carriers into your home while they are on duty." "I see," Nancy replied. "But don't you think this case was an exception? Poor Edgar Nixon had been battling the wind for a long time. He was exhausted. Anyway, he didn't bring his mailbag inside our house. He left it in this vestibule where you are standing." "That's even worse," the aide told her. "Our carriers know the rule. They must keep their bags with them at all times. But this doesn't excuse you." "Perhaps not," said Nancy. "I shall take the matter up with my father, and he will come to your office." Moore was not to be dismissed so easily. In a pompous manner, he asked, "What does your father have to do with this?" Nancy looked him straight in the eye. "The law says that when anyone is accused of a crime, he may consult his lawyer. My father is a lawyer." Her caller blinked. I suppose you're right. When the inspector returns, I shall pass the information along to him." Nancy did not comment on this. She knew that the postal inspector was a very reasonable man. Surely he would understand that the case of Edgar Nixon was indeed an exception. "Are you aware," she asked Moore, "that Edgar Nixon is in the hospital?" "I heard something of the sort, but this doesn't excuse him." "And now, if you'll excuse me," Nancy said, starting to close the door. With a mumbled reply, the officious young man turned and left the house. Mr. Drew came home early, explaining that he was so curious about what had taken place during the day, he wanted to get more details from Nancy at once. She smiled. "The whole thing gets more mysterious every minute. Listen to this." She told him about the investigative aide from the post office. When she finished, Mr. Drew burst into laughter. "My congratulations to you on telling him you would turn the case over to your lawyer." Then he sobered. "You are not to blame, Nancy, for the stolen letters. I'm sure Postal Inspector Wernick will agree with us." Nancy asked him how his client, Mrs. Quigley, had taken the loss of her money. Was she very upset? "She certainly was," the lawyer replied. "My secretary had to bring smelling salts and a cup of black coffee." Finally, Mrs. Quigley began to cry and admitted that she should have followed my advice and sent a check. Father and daughter talked a long time about the whole affair. Their conversation was interrupted by a phone call for Mr. Drew. He came back from answering it to tell Nancy an emergency had arisen. "I must go at once to see a client. He has been in a bad accident. I probably won't be home until late, so don't wait up for me, Nancy." She and Hannah Gruen ate alone. To cheer up Nancy, the housekeeper suggested that they go to a movie at the River Heights Theater. Nancy smiled. "You've talked me into it. I guess there's nothing more I can do tonight on the mystery anyway." By morning, however, the young detective's thoughts were back on the mystery. At breakfast and on the way to and from church, she reviewed the various angles of the mail theft. "Dad, do you suppose with Edgar Nixon's slight clue about the name Malmesbury, I could get a copy of the letter sent to me?" Mr. Drew smiled. "I believe so. Tomorrow morning I'll make a phone call to a lawyer friend in London. I'll ask him to look in the telephone directory and see what he can find out for us." That afternoon, Nancy went to call on Edgar Nixon in the hospital. He said no tests had been made yet, since it was Sunday, but these would be taken care of the following morning. "I suppose you are wondering," he said, "whether or not I have thought of any more clues to help you find your missing letter." He lowered his voice. Mind you, what I'm about to say I don't believe down deep in my heart, but it will explain why I fainted yesterday at your house. The mail carrier told about his half-brother Edgar. It was a repetition of what Hannah Gruen had already revealed. Ira added, however, that when Nancy had mentioned a man in a yellow coat with a beat-up car and part of his license plate number, he had thought for a moment it was his brother. But I'm sure it wasn't, he said. Edgar may be an annoyance to me, but I'm sure he's not a thief. Nancy did not comment. Instead, she asked, what did my little friend Tommy mean by a yellow coat? A smile flickered across Ira's face. Actually, it's a camel's hair coat. His hat is, too. A striking outfit, and incidentally, Edgar is rather handsome. A nurse stepped into the room to announce that visiting hours were over for the afternoon. Nancy said goodbye to the letter carrier and left. The following morning, Mr. Drew telephoned her from his office to report that he had talked to his friend in London. I have good news for you, Nancy. There is a law firm in the city by the name of Malmesbury and Bates Jones. I'm sure that's the one, Nancy said excitedly. I hope so, her father replied. In any case, my friend will telephone to them and find out if they sent a letter to you. He'll tell them the circumstances of your not receiving it and request a duplicate. On the other hand, if this is not the right firm, my friend will try to find the person who did write to you. Dad, that's wonderful, Nancy exclaimed. I hope we hear something soon. Her father chuckled. When you were a little girl, Nancy, you were always eager to have things happen. I used to say to you, hold your horses. Now I'm saying it again. Don't get your hopes up too high. Nancy laughed. Spoken like a lawyer, she teased, and then said goodbye. As soon as luncheon was over, Nancy told Hannah Gruen she was tired of staying in the house and waiting for news. I'm going to do some investigating, she announced. Where are you going? The housekeeper asked. To talk to some of Ira Nixon's neighbors. They may give me a clue that will be helpful in tracking down this Edgar Nixon. Despite Ira's faith in him, I think he's a good suspect. Mrs. Gruen agreed and kissed Nancy goodbye. The young detective drove to the other side of town and found Ira Nixon's little old-fashioned home. As she parked in front of the house, two women crossed the street and introduced themselves as Mrs. Malley and Mrs. O'Brien. They wanted to know if Nancy could tell them about the mail carrier's condition. He's better, she replied. In a way, it's fortunate that he got into the hospital. It sure is, Mrs. Bryan interrupted her. The poor old man doesn't eat right. Yes, her neighbor, Mrs. Malley, agreed, and added, he worries all the time about that no-good brother of his. Although curious to learn more about Ira's brother, Nancy commented cautiously, I've heard about Edgar. Tell me, is he really as bad as all that? Well, of course, I don't know what goes on inside the house when he comes there, Mrs. O'Brien went on. But I know the effect on Ira. He's just all in after one of those visits. Mrs. Malley leaned forward confidentially. Edgar was here this morning. Of course, he couldn't get in. I guess he didn't know where his brother was. And I, for one, wouldn't tell him. Me either, Mrs. O'Brien declared. That Edgar is nasty. A lot of papers flew off the seat of his car, and he wouldn't take time to pick them up. He littered the street, and we had to go around and clean up. Nancy asked eagerly, Where are the papers now? We put them in a trash can. Good place for them. They might be important, Nancy said. May I see them? The two women looked at each other, puzzled, but led the girl to Mrs. Malley's backyard. She opened the trash can and said, There they are. Nancy lifted them out one by one. All were letters and looked as if they had fallen into water. Most of the writing was illegible. One had had the top torn from it, and all but a few words had been obliterated, but the remaining few caught Nancy's attention. This must be part of the letter which had come to her from London. All that remained was ... Drew ... Money has been left ... I'd like to take this one along, she said. Help yourself, said Mrs. Malley. They don't belong to me anyway. They're just trash. I suggest, said Nancy, that you call the postal inspector and tell him about these letters. She rushed home. Her father was there, and she showed the sheet to him and Hannah Gruen. Both were amazed, but unable to decipher the intriguing message. Do you suppose somebody in England has left me some money? Nancy asked. It looks that way, her father replied. But who could it be? After staring at the paper for a while, Nancy began to calm down. I'm sure there must be some mistake, she said. I'm certainly not going to get my hopes up of becoming a millionaire. Her father and Mrs. Gruen laughed and said this was a sensible attitude to take. But, the housekeeper added, I hope a copy of the whole letter will come soon. I can't stand the suspense myself. On Tuesday morning, Nancy told Hannah Gruen that she was going on a shopping trip. You remember I'm going to spend the weekend at Emerson College? I need a few things, and this is a good time to get them. As she was about to pull out of the driveway, Nancy spotted a battered tan car parked down the street. It suddenly occurred to her that Edgar Nixon, or whoever had stolen the letters from the Drew home, might be watching her. At this distance, the person inside the car was too indistinct for her to identify, but she decided to get a closer look and started down the block. At once, the other car moved ahead. As she drew nearer, the driver suddenly turned around. The next second, he shot off at high speed. He certainly acts guilty, Nancy thought, and gave her own car greater power. Abruptly, the man turned down a side street, went a few blocks without pausing at intersections, and turned left out of sight. Nancy followed as quickly as she dared. When she reached the spot where he had made the last turn, Nancy could see him in the distance. The road proved to be an undeveloped one and had no side streets. She was able to follow more quickly and soon almost caught up to him. Now she could see the license plate. It was TJ 12796. That is Edgar Nixon, she thought. I mustn't lose him. In the next few seconds, Nancy neared a wooden bridge. She was almost directly behind the fugitive now. This bridge looks pretty rickety, she said to herself. Do I dare cross it? Edgar Nixon took the chance and sped over it. He made the distance without anything happening. Nancy went after him, but drove cautiously. Her car was much heavier, she knew. When Nancy was at the halfway mark, cracking sounds came from the dilapidated bridge. End of chapter 3.